on DAF Yutet Samid Aleph, and we were learning yesterday that Rabbi Akiva has a unique shita. Rabbi Akiva holds that you can have a shlishi l'tumah with chulin. That's the non-normative position. Normally, we've been maintaining that you can only have a shlishi l'tumah for truma and kadshim, and not for the most that chulin can become is a sheni l'tumah. Rabbi Akiva holds that it can become a shlishi l'tumah as well, and it's on that basis that the Gemara had demonstrated that Rabbi Akiva cannot subscribe to Rabbi Yossi's logical argument. Rabbi Yossi had made the following argument to prove that you can have a revi'i l'tumah for kadshim. Now the Torah doesn't explicitly state that you can have a revi'i l'tumah for kadshim, but Rabbi Yossi had demonstrated it from a logical argument. A logical argument was like this. We know that the Torah discusses a shlishi l'tumah because the Torah says that if chulin is tamei and it comes in contact with holy meat, then that meat can become tamei. So we know that a tamei chulin object can even be a sheni l'tumah, and if it therefore the Torah says that when it touches a kodshim object it become a shlishi, so we know that there's such a concept of a shlishi l'tumah from the Torah. Comes along Rabbi Yossi and says, we also know that a mechusar kippurim, someone who has a low level of tumah, is allowed to eat truma but is not allowed to eat kadshim. It therefore follows that whatever makes truma tameh, there's an even more there's a lighter tumah that can even affect or stigmatize kadshim. So if you can have a shlishi l'tumah for truma, then you must be able to have a revi'i l'tumah for kadshim. That was Rabbi Yossi's logical argument. The Gemara says Rabbi Akiva can't subscribe to that line of reasoning because if he did, then Rabbi Akiva would have to maintain that you can have a chamishi l'tumah for kadshim. And the reason is because the way that Rabbi Akiva would use Rabbi Yossi's pasuk is that the pasuk that Rabbi Yossi used to demonstrate that you can have a shlishi l'tumah from the Torah is from the pasuk that says that when chulin is tamei and if it touches kadshim, the kadshim becomes tamei. So you see that kadshim is subject to a shlishi l'tumah. According to the pasuk that Rabbi Yossi brought, if Rabbi Akiva was going to look at that pasuk, he would say that the source of the tumah in that pasuk could even be a shlishi l'tumah because chulin can even be a shlishi. And if that's the case, then truma should be able to become a revi'i, and kadshim should be able to become a chamishi. And yet the Gemara says we have no brisa. No one ever brings a brisa to say that there's a revi'i for tumah for truma, or that there's a chamishi l'tumah for kadshim. And basically the Gemara is bringing proof of omission. The proof is there is no such brisa. No such brisa exists that we could even attribute to Rabbi Akiva as having said that. And the Gemara says at this point, basing that as our argument, va'anan ahachi nekom v'nismach. And it is on that basis that we can reliably say that Rabbi Akiva must not subscribe to Rabbi Yossi, and that Rabbi Akiva, even though he holds you could have a shlishi l'tumah in chulin, would never agree that you could have a revi'i of tumah for truma, or that you can have a chamishi l'tumah for kadshim. The Gemara says, Nafak Ravashi v'itema Rav Kahana dak v'ashkach. So we're not sure whether it was Ravashi or Rav Kahana, but one of the two went out and not only said that we have a proof by omission, but we actually have a brisa that demonstrates that that's Rabbi Akiva's shita. Because haditnan hakli mitzaref esmasha b'socho l'kodesh avolo l'truma. The first part of the Mishnah states that if you have a box or some other large utensil, and it has multiple items in it, even though they're not touching each other, but the fact that they're inside the same box, so if the items are truma items, then by virtue of the fact that one person who's tamei touches one of the items, that will not make the other truma items tamei. But for kadshim, for sacrificial meat or other items, if the person who's tamei touches one item, by virtue that they're all in the same container, then all of the items will become tamei. That's the first halacha. The second halacha is v'haravi'i b'kodesh pasul v'hashlishi b'truma. That when you have a revi'i, that's the highest level, or I should say the most extreme level of tumah that you can get for kadshim, And a shlishi is the most extreme level of tumah that you can get for truma. Va'amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba. So that's the Mishnah. But Rabbi Chia bar Abba is able to demonstrate from that Mishnah that Amar Rabbi Yechanan me'idushel Rabbi Akiva nishneis Mishnah zu. That Rabbi Akiva was the one who had to testify to the halachas of that Mishnah. Meaning Rabbi Akiva is the author. Now once we know that Rabbi Akiva is the author, then we've proved our point, which is that even though Rabbi Akiva says you can have a shlishi l'tumah in chulin, you can't go more than a shlishi for truma or a revi in kodshim. Ditznan, how do we know that Rabbi Akiva is the author? Because we have another Mishnah that says, Hosif Rabbi Akiva hasoles v'hakatores v'halavona v'hagecholim shimnogat v'ulyam b'miksasan pasoles kulan. That Rabbi Akiva said the same halacha as the first part of that Mishnah. That the first part of the Mishnah said that when you have kodshim items collected in a box together, even though they're disparate items, meaning they're not touching each other, if a person touches one of the items, then all of the items become tameh. So we see that this Mishnah, the first Mishnah, goes according to Rabbi Akiva. Revi in chamishi lo, shlishi in revi lo. So you see that Rabbi Akiva only allows for revi for kodshim and a shlishi for truma, not a chamishi and for kodshim and not a revi'i for truma. QED, that proves our point. Now the Gemara says, incidentally, now that you've talked about this issue of tziruf, which is the ability to say that all of the disconnected items in a box are considered to be connected as far as tumah, when we're dealing with the laws of kodshim, alma kisavar tziruf derabana. We see from that latter brisa, or latter Mishnah, maybe I can ask you to close the door, please. We see from that latter Mishnah that Rabbi Akiva holds that this principle of tziruf is a rabbinic principle. Now, how do you see that? So Rashi points out that one of the items that Rabbi Akiva said can be conjoined, because they're in the same box, are coals. That Rabbi Akiva had said that flour, incense, frankincense, and coals, all of these things are granulated, discrete items. And if you touch one, then all of the items in the container become tameh. Now, coal is not something which would normally be subject to tumah, because it's not a kli and it's not a food item. So why is it that coal is subject to tumah? And the answer is because of something called chibuv kodshim, that we show a chibas kodshim is that the fact that we have such an affinity for sacrificial items that we upgrade their status midirabanan to make them like food items, even when they're not edibles, right? And that's why coal can contract tumah, even though it's not a food item and it's not a kli, and that only works midirabanan.
Because it burns the korbanot?
It's because it's used in sacrificial service. Yeah.
What about wood then?
Perhaps wood too, but wood is not granular in nature. These are things that are little pieces of things that are not connected. But it could be that wood as well. The point is that because Rabbi Akiva is discussing a rabbinic law, it stands to reason that the whole din of tziruf that he's addressing is a rabbinic law to begin with. Otherwise, he should have distinguished between that which works rabbinically and that which works biblically. The fact that he puts them all in the same category, both food items and non-food items, means that the whole principle is working rabbinically in the first place.
What's the translation, Rabbi, of tziruf?
Tziruf is conjoinability.
Okay, thank you.
So, upliga de Rabbi Chanan. And therefore, Rabbi Akiva disagrees with Rabbi Chanan, the Amar tziruf de oraisa, because he says that tziruf, this principle that you can conjoin items that are in the same container, that's a biblical principle. Shenemar kaf achas asara zahav meliyah ketoris. The Torah talks about the gifts of the Nesiim, and it says that when there was one bowl that was of 10 silver, a weight of 10 gold, rather, that it was filled with ketoris. Why does the Torah call it one bowl? Hakasavasa kol masha bekaf echas. The Torah says that all the things that are contained within one bowl are all one. That's the reason why it talks about one bowl, to tell you that the bowl unifies all of its contents. But that's according to Rabbi Chanan, who says that there's a biblical law based on a pasuk, and Rabbi Akiva disagrees. He says it's only a rabbinic law. Now, let's go on. Tanan Hasan. Now let's look at another Mishnah, and this Mishnah is very cryptic, so you're going to have a lot of questions that you're going to want to ask on this Mishnah, And all I ask is that you suspend your questions until we clarify it through the Gemara. I guarantee you that whatever you're going to ask, the Gemara is going to ask as well. Tanan Hasa. So we have a Mishnah that says, Al machat shenimtseis bebasar, if you have a needle that is found in a piece of sacrificial meat, shahasakin v'hayadayim tahoros, that the knife that is used to cut the meat, or to slaughter the animal, or to cut the meat, the animal, to dismember the animal, and the hands that come in contact with this meat, even though you have a needle that has some stigma of tumah on it, we don't know yet what that stigma is. The halacha is that both the person's hands that touch the meat and the knife that cuts the meat is going to be tahor. B'habasar tummy, however, the meat itself, because it's in direct contact with the needle, that basar is going to be tummy. Nimtseis beperesh hakol tahor. If, however, when you dismember the animal, you open up its intestines and you discover a needle in its dung, so then even the dung is going to be tahor because the dung is not a food item. So that's what the Mishnah says. Amar Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva now says, Zachinu she'in tumas yadayim b'mikdash. Here's what we benefit by having a case in the Beis HaMikdash. The benefit is that even though normally when the rabbis were gozer, they were gozer that hands that are unwashed and that are untreated automatically have the status of being a sheni l'tumah, and therefore hands are much more susceptible to becoming tameh mid'Rabbanan. The Rabbanan never made this gezerah with hands inside the Beis HaMikdash, meaning that the Rabbanan suspended all rabbinic tumah law inside the Beis HaMikdash, and the reason why they did that is because they didn't want to unnecessarily disqualify sacrificial items. It's one thing to make a decree outside the Beis HaMikdash because you're dealing with stuff that's outside the temple, but once you're inside the temple, it's a liability. It's something that's negative if we will be strict on tumah mid'Rabbanan and create tumah when none really exists. So that's why you can say that we've sort of saved ourselves from a tumah of the hands by discussing a case in the Beis HaMikdash.
It's pragmatic.
It's very pragmatic.
But they didn't wash their hands?
No, the Kohanim had to wash their hands before they did the avoda. They absolutely had to. As a matter of fact, if they didn't wash their hands, the avoda would not be kosher. But what we're saying is even though this needle has a stigma of tumah, nevertheless, it does not carry over to the hands, which are normally the most sensitive part of the body to contracting tumah. That's what the Gemara is saying. Okay? So now the Gemara says, V'neima she'ein tumas yadayim v'kelim b'mikdash. Now, I don't understand why Rabbi Akiva made that statement, limiting it only to the hands not being tummy in the Beis HaMikdash. He should have said that not only are hands not tummy, but kelim are not tummy mid'Rabbanan in the Beis HaMikdash, because the case of the Mishnah was that both the knife and the hands are not tummy, even though they've come into some level of contact with the needle. So he should have said that not only is there no rabbinic decree against hands, there's also no rabbinic decree against utensils in the Beis HaMikdash. So the Gemara says, Amar of Yehuda Amar Ravi, Tema Reb Yossi B'Rebbi Chanina, Yadayim Kodem Gezeras Kelim Nishnu. He says, I'll tell you why Rabbi Akiva didn't address the knife. Because the knife, historically, there were two different periods historically when the rabbis made their rabbinic decrees. They first made a rabbinic decree that hands are very sensitive to tumah, and later on, historically, they made a decree that that utensils can contract tumah from other utensils. Now we know that midioraisa, under most circumstances, a kli cannot make another kli tumah. Right? We know that already. Yes. Do you remember we've learned that one kli cannot make another kli tamei, yes, with rare exception. We'll see an exception today shortly. But one kli cannot make another kli tamei. The rabbis were gozer that under certain conditions one kli can make another kli tamei, but they suspended that inside the temple, and that's why the knife is not tamei. But now the Gemara is suggesting that decree that one kli can make another kli tamei mid'Rabbanan had not yet been instituted when Rabbi Akiva made his statement. And therefore, Rabbi Akiva had no reason to say, well, because we're dealing with the Beis HaMikdash, we've saved the knife from becoming tamei, because even outside the Beis HaMikdash, historically that decree had not yet been made. And so therefore he had no reason to address the saving of the knife because it was in the Beis HaMikdash, because even outside the Beis HaMikdash, there was no such decree yet made.
This decree occurred, the change just occurred right at the end of the period?
The decree occurred at some point historically, and Rabbi Akiva was saying that when this Mishnah was taught, that decree had not yet been made.
Oh.
Was it made at the same time that a liquid cannot make the same liquid?
We don't know. We don't know. But I'm just talking about these two. Okay, these two. One, that hands are more susceptible to tumah was made earlier. That a kli can become tamei from another kli had not yet been made when this Mishnah was taught. So the Gemara now says, but that's impossible. So Amar Rava v'hataravayu bo bayom gazru. I can prove to you that both of those decrees were made at the same time. How do you know this? Did not, because we have a Mishnah in Shabbos that we learned together. HaSefer v'hayadayim v'hatful yom v'ha'ochlin v'ha'kelim shnitmu b'mashkin. That there were 18 things that the rabbis decreed on one day in this aliyah, in this attic of Hananiah ben Chizkiah. And they made the following, they made 18 decrees, and among those 18 decrees were that a Sefer Torah that comes in contact with Truma renders the Truma tamei. They also decreed that unwashed hands that comes in contact with Truma renders the Truma tamei. They also decreed that at Tful Yom, a person who has not yet had sunset after going to the mikveh renders Truma tamei. The Gemara asks on that and says, but wait a minute, that's the Oraisa. So the Gemara says, you're right. Erase those two words, Tful Yom, from the Mishnah. So we're going to skip over those. And food and utensils that have become tamei through liquid also have the ability to make other things tamei, including food and utensils. So you see very clearly that the decree on hands and the decree on kalim were done on the very same day. So how can you suggest that historically they happened at two different times in history? So Ela Amar Rava, Hanach l'tumasakin da'afilu b'chulin nami lo mitame. So the Gemara rather says Rava, no, that we're dealing with a scenario where even outside the Beis HaMikdash, this knife would not become tamei. Now, we don't know yet why. We just know that with hands, if this was outside the Beis HaMikdash, a person's hands would become tamei. But inside the Beis HaMikdash, we're alleviated of that. But when it comes to the knife, because it's not coming, for whatever reason, it's not coming in direct contact with the needle, we're not sure yet, for some cryptic reason which we haven't yet described, regardless of whether it's inside the Beis HaMikdash or outside the Beis HaMikdash, this knife is not going to become tamei. So now the question is, what are we talking about? So, hai sakin denaga b'mai. So when this knife was used to cut the meat, what did it come in contact with? Ilema denaga b'basar ha'ein ochel mitame kli. If it only touched the meat and never touched the knife, never touched the needle, so then obviously the knife can't become tamei because food cannot be matame a kli. So ve'ela denaga b'machat, if it touched the needle, v'ha ein kli matame kli. One kli cannot make another kli tamei, and that's also outside the Beis HaMikdash unless there's a liquid medium between the two. So the Gemara's question is, why then would you argue that this knife would be, in other words, what's the point of the Mishnah telling me that this knife is saved from tumah? Obviously it is. So, hai machat maya vidite. So let's find out, what's the story with this needle? So, ine masafek machat, maybe you'll tell me that you're dealing with a needle where it's just a suffix whether it's tamei or not. So, v'ha itmar Rabbi Elazar v'Rabbi Yossi v'Rabbi Chanina, chad amar lo gazru al safek harokin shebi Yerushalayim, v'chad amar lo gazru al safek hakelim shebi Yerushalayim. Well, if this needle is only suffix whether it was exposed to tumah, we have two statements made by two great Amoraim. One said that when you find spittle in Yerushalayim, and you're not sure whether it came from a zav or a person who's tohar, you always assume that it's tohar. And the other one said that whenever you find a kli in Yerushalayim and you're safek, whether it's tamei or tahor, you always assume that it's tahor. Here, again, it's based on the same consideration that we mentioned before. The rabbis had a greater interest in making sure that Yerushalayim was tahor than they had in making chumras on tumah, because the more tumah you introduce to Yerushalayim, the more sacrificial items become tainted, and they didn't want that to happen indiscriminately. So basically, the question that the Gemara is asking is, if there's only a suffix on this needle, then the needle automatically would have a din of being tohor because the Beis HaMikdash is in Yerushalayim. And the Gemara now says, Amar of Yehuda Amar Rav, so the way we're going to explain it is as follows. Kagon sha'avdelo machat tmei meis, v'hikira b'basar. What we're talking about is where the needle actually had the same tumah as a tmei meis. Now we know, and we're going to explain this again explicitly, that when a piece of metal, a metal utensil, comes in contact with someone who's an av hatumah because he touched a corpse, then the metal assumes the same status as the person who touched it. We learned that previously from the pasuk of Bachal al Cherev, when a sword is impaled into a corpse. We know that the sword has the same status as the corpse. So any metal utensil that comes in contact with tumas meis takes the same status as the thing that touched it. So if a person touched a corpse and then he touches the knife, so the person is a av hatuma, and the knife also becomes an av hatuma. We're going to speak this out momentarily. I just wanted to give you the sort of the preview. And basically, it's on that basis. We're not dealing with a, and then you discover this needle inside the piece of meat. Now we'll talk about then why the knife is not going to be tummy. We'll get to that in just a minute. Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Abin Omar Kegon Shahaisa Para Chasuma Uba'a Michutz l'Yerushalayim. Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Abi gives a different answer. He says no. You're dealing with a needle which is safek tamei, safek tohor. What about your question that in Yerushalayim anything that's a safek is automatically tohor? This needle did not come from Yerushalayim. This needle was eaten by a cow that was outside of Yerushalayim, and then it was muzzled from the time that it came from outside Yerushalayim into Yerushalayim. It was then slaughtered while it was muzzled, so it couldn't have consumed this needle inside Yerushalayim. And then you find it's the needle inside its flesh. In that scenario, then the needle still has the din of being a safek tumah, and it's on that basis that the knife is not going to be tummy, which we'll have to analyze further. Now, before we analyze the case of the knife and the needle, let's go back to what these two Amoraim said. Gufa, Rebbe Lazar v'Rebbe Yossi b'Rebbe Chanina, Chad Omer lo gazru al safek haroken shebirushalayim, v'Chad Omer lo gazru al safek kelim shebirushalayim. One of them said that anytime you find spittle in Yerushalayim, we automatically assume that it's tahor. There's no decree to make it tameh. And the other one says that when you find a kli in Yerushalayim, we automatically assume it's tahor. We make no decrees. So the Gemara asks, why do you need two Amoraim to make these statements? These are already taught explicitly in the Mishnah. Rokin Tanina, Kalim Tanina. Both of these halachas have already been taught in Mishnayos. Rokin Tanina, the idea of spittle that you find in Yerushalayim as being automatically tahor, that was taught in a Mishnah. Ditnan kol harokin haninsoim b'Yerushalayim tahorin chutz mishel shuk ha'elya. The Mishnah says that any spittle that's found in Yerushalayim is automatically tahor, except for spittle that you find in the upper marketplace. There was something known as the Shuk HaElyon, the upper marketplace in Yerushalayim. The reason, if you find spittle there, you have to be chayshesh that it's tameh is because that's dafka, a place that people who were tameh used to go to avoid spreading tumah to other places in Yerushalayim. So there, since there's a greater concentration of people who are tameh, there we do have to be chayshesh that the spittle is tameh, but nowhere else. So the Gemara's question is, why then did this Amora have to make the statement that's already explicitly in the Mishnah? Lo tzricha afal gav dischazek zav. The answer is because that Amora was telling me that even if I saw a zav walking down a certain street in Yerushalayim, and then later we walk down the street and we find a mound of spittle in the street, we don't have to be choshesh that maybe it came from that zav. That's his point. Not only when you don't know where it came from at all, because there was no zav that we saw, but even when you saw a zav, with something that's what we say is ischazek yisura, when we know that there was a person who was tummy that was here, we still can assume that it didn't come from him.
But that's a sveka anyway.
No. Don't get too fancy, Chaim. All right, it's ischazek yisura. And nevertheless, he says that it's okay. Whether it's a svek or not, we'll let you look in the Shev Shmeitz and you go through it there. So now the Gemara says, Kalim Tanina. What about the fact that Kalim? What about the fact that utensils were already taught explicitly in a Mishnah? What's the Mishnah that you're referring to? Ditnan kol ha-kelim hanimtzoyim b'Yerushalayim derech yerida lebeis hatfila tameim. The Mishnah has said that there used to be a mikveh that people used to go to in Yerushalayim where they would immerse their utensils when they became tamei. And it was just like a ride in the amusement park. There was a special path that you went to go into the ride, and there was another path that was the exit from the ride. I was just at an amusement park on Sunday, which is why it made me think of this, because when you go on the roller coaster, there's one way, and then there's the exit. You got to look for the exit from the... Anyway, so there was one place where you went to go to the mikveh, and there was another pathway to leave the mikveh. This was for very practical reasons. You didn't want to bump into someone who was on his way into the mikveh who was tamei, right? So they had a special path that you would leave from after everything was tahor, where after you and your utensil were tahor. So the way it worked was, it says in the Mishnah that the only kalim that are assumed to be tamei is if you find a kli on the pathway going to the mikveh, then you assume it's tamei. So the Gemara says that we can infer from there that hada alma tahorin, that any other kli found in Yerushalayim, in the streets of Yerushalayim, is going to be tahor as long as it's not on that pathway going into the mikveh. So the question that the Gemara is asking is, why did the Amora have to make the statement if it's already taught in the Mishnah? The Gemara says, "V'li taimei chema seifa," but take a look at the seifa. It says derech aliyah tahorin. It says that if you have a pathway that's leaving the mikveh, then you can assume, if you don't know its status, you can assume it's tahor, hada alma tamein. So why don't we infer from that latter statement that anything that's found in the streets of Yerushalayim should automatically be tummy? Because only when it's on the pathway out of the mikveh can we assume that it's tahor. So elareisha dafka v'seifa lav dafka ulafike giziyasa. So the Gemara says you have to conclude that the first statement, where the only time that you have to be choshesh that a kli that you find is tamei, is only if it's on the pathway into the mikveh. And the second statement is not to be taken literally, that if it's on the pathway out of the mikveh, it's tahor, and only there is it tahor. No. In all cases, any other pathway of Yerushalayim, a kli that's found is tahor. Why then did the Mishnah have to make a statement that it's when it's found on the way out, it's tahor? It's because there were certain corollary paths that were also accessible to both pathways, the pathway leading into the mikveh and the pathway leading out of the mikveh. And sometimes these small little corollary paths could connect both the entrance to the mikveh and the exit from the mikveh. And it's there that if you find a kli and you're not sure whether the kli was left by someone on the way to the path to the mikveh or on the way to the path from the mikveh, then you have to be choshesh that the kli is tamei. And that's what the second statement of the Mishnah is coming to teach you, that only when you find the kli on the main path that is the exit from the mikveh can you assume that it's tahor. But all other pathways throughout Yerushalayim, you can also assume it's tahor. The only times that you have to be choshesh that it's tamei is if it's on the main path to the mikveh, or if it's on a corollary path that's nearby the mikveh. But in any event, the Gemara says, but we can explain that that's the reason why the Amora had to make the statement, that when you find a kli in the streets of Yerushalayim, you can assume it's tahor because it's a little bit ambiguous from this Mishnah. So now let's go back to our case of the needle and the meat and the knife. So ularav da omar kagon sha'avdalo machat tmeimeis v'hikira bebasar. Rav had said that the Mishnah, which tells me that the knife is tahor, we're talking about a case where the knife is cutting into meat, where the needle that's inside the meat has the status of an av hatuma. So the question is, Kevin da omar mar b'chalal cherev harehu kechalal So if, according to the Mishnah which had taught us that the knife that has the same status as the corpse that it impales, so then why shouldn't this needle have the status of an av hatuma? So adam v'kelim nami litame. Whenever you have, even though we said previously that one kli cannot be matame another kli, that's under normal circumstances. But when the kli has the din of an av hatuma, so then that needle should be able to be matame. It should be able to be matame a human being, and it should be able to be matame a kli as well. So why isn't the knife tame? So the Gemara answers, Amar Rav Ashi zos omeres azara rishus harabim hi v'havale safek tuma birshus harabim v'chol safek tuma birshus harabim sfeiko tohor. Answers the Gemara as follows. Here's a new principle that is taught in many places in Shas, that whenever you have a public domain which is traversed by the masses, if you have a safek tuma in a brishus harabim, in a public domain, then automatically we assume that it's tahor. Now, what
in Jerusalem?
No. Any safek tuma in rishus harabim, it is assumed to be tahor. Period. The chiddush of the Mishnah is that the courtyard of the temple has the status of a rishus harabim because it is traversed by the masses. That's the point that we're learning over here. When a knife cuts into this meat, even if it does come in contact with the needle, it will still be tohar because we only have a suffix whether or not this needle is tohar or tame. And I guess maybe I think what we're suggesting is that we're not sure whether the knife actually cut into. Yes, that's what Rashi says. Rashi says explicitly, we have a suffix whether the knife, we know the knife touched the meat, but we have a suffix whether the knife touched the needle or not, and therefore it's a suffix tuma birshus harabim, and therefore it's automatically assumed to be tohar. Now, what is the source text for this halacha that suffix tuma birshus harabim sfeiko tohar? The source text.
Mice.
Yeah.
It's a mice.
Sounds like big mice. The source text is from the law of Sota. Sota, the Torah says that even when we're not sure whether she was faithful or not, we assume she was unfaithful, and that's why she has to drink the Sota water. Now, in the case over there by Sota, and by the way, infidelity is also called Tuma, that she defiled herself, she was matame herself, okay? Now, the case of Sota is where we saw that she secluded herself in a private domain with a man, and we just don't know whether she was unfaithful to her husband or not in that private place with the other man. We assume, therefore, that she was. We learn from there that Safek Tuma Birshus HaYachid is Tameh, and by inference, Safek Tuma Birshus HaRabim is Tor. This is all derived in Maseches Sota and other places in Shas. Now,
there wouldn't be any Sota in Rishus HaRabim, though.
Well, that's the point, is that because the Sota case is the exemplar for Tuma, only in Rishus HaYachid is she Tameh, but in Rishus HaRabim she's Tor. So, that's the basis for this teaching that Safek Tuma Birshus HaRabim is Tor. So the Gemara now says, Haber Rishus HaYachid Sfeiko Tami. Who? So you're telling me that in a comparable case, you're going to tell me that with the knife had a suffix, whether it came in contact with this needle in a Rishus HaYachid, we would automatically assume it's Tami, just like Sota? Mechti, Haimacha Davar Shein Bo Das Li Shoelu. B'chol Davar Shein Bo Das Li Shoel, Bein B'Rishus HaRabim, Bein B'Rishus HaYachid Sfeiko Tor. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute. The only time that we analogize to Sota is if you're dealing with a situation where human knowledge is involved. Because in order to compare it to Sota, what is the case of Sota? You can go over to the woman and ask her, do you have knowledge of whether you committed adultery or not? She may not answer the question, but at least she can be consulted on the issue. And therefore the Gemara says that only in those cases where a human being is involved, do we have this halacha that Safik Tumah B'Rishus HaYachid is Tameh, and Safik Tumah B'Rishus HaRabim is Tahor. But let's say we have a situation where a Kli may have touched a sheretz, and no human being was there, and no human being was involved. We don't know whether there was an exposure of this Kli to the sheretz or not. There we don't say Safik Tumah B'Rishus HaYachid is Tameh. There we also say Safik Tumah B'Rishus HaYachid is Tahor, because there's no Ein Bo Das Lishol. We cannot ask the knife, did you touch the sheretz or not? And we cannot ask the sheretz, did you touch the knife or not? So therefore the Gemara says, you see from here, this is not an analogous case to Sota. How can you make that statement to say, well, the reason why the knife is Tahor is because it's a Safik Tumah B'Rishus HaRabim. Even if it was Safik Tumah B'Rishus HaYachid, the knife would still be Tahor because there's no human being involved here. The Gemara says, Mishum Dahave Safik Tumah Haba Bidei Adam. The answer is that no, there is a human being involved here because the knife is being handled by a human being. A human being is using the knife to cut into the meat, and therefore there is human involvement here. V'amar Rabbi Yochanan Safik Tumah Haba Bidei Adam Nishalena Aleha Afilu B'chli Hamunach Al Gabe Karka Kedavar Sheyesh Bo Das Lishayil. Because as Rabbi Yochanan had said, that when you have an inanimate object, but there's been a human being involved in the system, even if the knife was on the ground, but a human being was carrying a sheretz, and the question is, while he was carrying the sheretz, we don't know whether he touched the knife that's on the ground or not with the sheretz, even though the knife is an inanimate object, but that's called yesh bo das lishol, because there's a human being involved in the scenario. And similarly over here, even though the knife is inanimate, but since there's a human being involved in the cutting of the knife, using the knife to cut with, therefore it's yesh bo das lishol, and therefore we apply the rule of Sota, that the only reason why the knife is tohor is because it's in a Rishus HaRabim. Had the knife been in a Rishus HaYachid, the knife would have been rendered tamei misafik. And this is where we'll hold it here for today. We still have a lot of unanswered questions, but at least according to Rav, we understand. The hands are tohor, and the knife is tohor. The hands are tohor because there was no gzeira of susceptibility to the hands to becoming tamei in the Beis HaMikdash. And the knife is tohor because it's a Safik Tumah B'Rishus HaRabim, and kol Safik Tumah B'Rishus HaRabim Sveiko is tohor. Have a wonderful day.